Welcome back to Timeless Thinkers, where history's greatest minds speak again and where we explore the ideas that shaped our world. I'm your host, and in our previous episode, we explored David Hume's devastating skepticism, his challenges to causation, induction, moral reasoning, and the very existence of the self. Hume showed that much of what we take for granted rests on unprovable foundations, that reason is the slave of the passions, and that morality springs from sentiment rather than rational principle. But Hume's closest friend would take these insights in a surprising direction, not toward more skepticism, but toward understanding how human nature, with all its limitations and passions, could create prosperity and social order. Adam Smith was Hume's intellectual companion, his most trusted friend, and in many ways his successor as the greatest mind of the Scottish Enlightenment. Where Hume questioned the foundations of knowledge and morality, Smith asked, how do societies actually work? How do people cooperating through self-interest create wealth? How do moral sentiments guide us even when reason falls short? His answers would create the modern discipline of economics and profoundly shape how we understand markets, labor, and the role of government. This is the story of Adam Smith, the moral philosopher who explained the wealth of nations. Adam Smith was baptized on June 16, 1723, in the small port town of Kirkcaldy, Fife, Scotland. His exact birth date is unknown, only his baptism was recorded. His father, also named Adam Smith, had been a comptroller of customs in Kirkcaldy, but died several months before his son was born. Smith was raised by his mother, Margaret Douglas, with whom he would live for most of his life. Their bond was extraordinarily close. She lived to age 90 and died just 6 years before her son. According to early accounts, when Smith was about 3 years old, he was briefly kidnapped by Romani travelers while visiting his grandfather. He was recovered within hours, but the incident, if true, suggests how precious he was to his family. What we know for certain is that young Adam was a bookish, thoughtful child who showed early signs of brilliance. At age 14, in 1737, Smith entered the University of Glasgow, one of Scotland's great intellectual centers. There he studied under Francis Hutcheson, the influential moral philosopher who emphasized moral sense and benevolence. Hutcheson's ideas about sympathy and natural sociability would deeply influence Smith's later work. The education at Glasgow was vibrant, engaged, and challenging, everything Smith hoped for in intellectual life. In 1740, Smith won a Snell Exhibition Scholarship to Balliol College, Oxford. He would spend 6 years there, from 1740 to 1746, and he hated almost every moment. Oxford, he later concluded, was intellectually stagnant compared to Glasgow. The professors were complacent, the curriculum outdated, the whole atmosphere one of privilege without purpose. Smith spent his time reading voraciously on his own. Reportedly, his tutors once confiscated his copy of David Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature, considering it dangerously skeptical. This was Smith's introduction to the philosopher who would become his closest friend and greatest intellectual influence. Smith returned to Scotland in 1746 and began delivering public lectures in Edinburgh on rhetoric and jurisprudence from 1748 to 1751. These lectures were successful and brought him into contact with Edinburgh's intellectual elite, including David Hume. The two men, despite a 12-year age difference, became intimate friends. Their correspondence and mutual admiration would last until Hume's death in 1776. Hume called Smith one of the wisest men he knew. Smith considered Hume by far the most illustrious philosopher and historian of the age. In 1751, at age 27, Smith was appointed professor of logic at the University of Glasgow. Within a year, he transferred to the more prestigious chair of moral philosophy, the position his beloved teacher Hutcheson had held. From 1752 to 1764, Smith taught moral philosophy at Glasgow, covering natural theology, ethics, jurisprudence, and political economy. He was a popular teacher, despite a somewhat awkward manner and tendency toward absent-mindedness. Students found his ideas exciting and his enthusiasm infectious. During these Glasgow years, Smith published his first major work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in 1759. The book was an immediate success and established Smith's reputation throughout Britain and Europe. Building on Hume's insight that morality rests on sentiment rather than reason, Smith developed a sophisticated account of how sympathy allows us to make moral judgments. We imagine ourselves in others' situations, feel what they feel, and judge actions by whether an impartial spectator, an imagined fair observer, would approve. The book went through 6 editions in Smith's lifetime, and he continued revising it until the year of his death. The success of the theory of moral sentiments changed Smith's life. In 1764, he was offered a position as tutor to Henry Scott, the young 3rd Duke of Buccleuch. The job came with a generous salary of £300 per year for life. This was an extraordinary sum, more than twice his professor's salary, and it would be paid whether Smith worked or not. He resigned his Glasgow professorship and spent 1764 to 1766 traveling through France and Switzerland with his aristocratic pupil. In France, Smith moved in the highest intellectual circles. He met the physiocrats, French economists like François Quesnay and Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, who argued that agriculture was the source of all wealth and that government should allow natural economic laws to operate freely. He met Voltaire in Geneva. He engaged with the philosophers in Paris. These encounters with French economic thought significantly influenced the project that was already forming in his mind, a comprehensive analysis of how nations become wealthy. Smith returned to Scotland in 1766 and settled in Kirkcaldy with his mother. For the next 10 years, he worked on what would become his masterpiece. Day after day, he read, thought, wrote, and revised. He was meticulously careful, consulting sources, refining arguments, crafting examples. His mother managed the household. Smith focused entirely on his book. On March 9, 1776, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations was published. The timing was remarkable. 4 months later, on July 4, 1776, the American colonies declared independence. 5 months after that, on August 25, 1776, David Hume died in Edinburgh. In one extraordinary year, Smith's greatest work appeared. A new nation was born proclaiming economic and political freedom, and Smith lost his dearest friend. Hume died knowing that Smith's book was published, but too ill to read it thoroughly. It was dedicated to the memory of David Hume. The Wealth of Nations was not an immediate bestseller, but its influence grew steadily. Smith had created a new way of thinking about economics, not as the management of a royal treasury or a mercantilist zero-sum game, but as the study of how ordinary people's choices in markets create prosperity. He showed that the wealth of a nation depends not on hoarding gold, but on productive labor, that markets coordinate activity better than central planning, that specialization and trade benefit everyone. These ideas would transform economic thought and eventually economic policy. In 1778, Smith was appointed Commissioner of Customs for Scotland, a well-paid government position in Edinburgh. There's a certain irony here. Smith, the great advocate of free trade, spent his final years enforcing the very tariffs and trade restrictions he had criticized in The Wealth of Nations. But Smith understood the difference between ideal policy and existing law. As a public official, he took his duties seriously and enforced the law diligently. Smith never married. He lived with his mother until her death in 1784, an event that devastated him. In his final years, he continued revising the theory of moral sentiments, producing a 6th edition in 1790 that significantly expanded his discussion of self-command and propriety.
He maintained friendships, engaged in Edinburgh's intellectual life, and enjoyed the respect of scholars throughout Europe. As he neared death in 1790, Smith asked his executors to burn 16 volumes of his manuscripts, nearly everything he had written that wasn't published. We'll never know what was in those volumes, perhaps lectures, perhaps drafts of works he considered incomplete, perhaps private thoughts he wished to remain private. The executors obeyed his wishes. Only his published works and some correspondence survive.
Adam Smith died on July 17, 1790, at age 67 in Edinburgh. He was buried in Canongate Kirkyard with a modest ceremony befitting a man who had little interest in personal glory. But his ideas lived on. His two great books, one on morality, one on economics, would shape intellectual life for centuries. He had shown that moral philosophy and economic analysis are connected, that understanding human nature is essential to understanding society, and that self-interest, properly channeled through markets and constrained by sympathy and justice, can create prosperity and social harmony. Smith's life was relatively quiet, no dramatic scandals, no political intrigue, just decades of careful thought and writing. Yet this absent-minded professor who walked into a tanning pit while lost in thought, who lived with his mother and never married, who burned his papers rather than seek posthumous fame, this man changed how we understand the modern world. Before Adam Smith became known as the father of economics, he was celebrated as a moral philosopher. In 1759, 17 years before The Wealth of Nations, Smith published The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The book was an immediate success and established his reputation throughout Europe. It went through 6 editions in Smith's lifetime, and he was still revising it in 1790, the year of his death. Yet today, The Theory of Moral Sentiments is often neglected, overshadowed by The Wealth of Nations. This is unfortunate, because you cannot fully understand Smith's economics without understanding his moral philosophy. The two works are parts of a unified vision of human nature and society. The Theory of Moral Sentiments begins with one of the most famous opening sentences in philosophy. How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. From the very first sentence, Smith challenges the idea that humans are purely selfish. Yes, we pursue our own interests, but we also care about others. We feel pleasure when they're happy and pain when they suffer. This capacity, which Smith calls sympathy, is the foundation of his moral theory. Smith built on his friend David Hume's insight that morality rests on sentiment rather than reason. Hume had argued that moral judgments express feelings of approval or disapproval, not discoveries of rational truths. Smith accepted this sentiment-based approach, but developed it in new directions. Where Hume had been somewhat skeptical and minimalist, Smith was constructive and systematic. He wanted to explain not just that morality comes from sentiment, but exactly how the moral sentiments work, what distinctions they allow us to make, and how they guide us in evaluating conduct. Sympathy, for Smith, doesn't simply mean feeling sorry for someone. It's a much broader concept. Sympathy is our capacity to enter imaginatively into another person's situation and feel what they feel. When we see someone in pain, we imagine ourselves in their position and feel a corresponding unease. When we see someone rejoicing, we imagine their joy and feel pleasure ourselves. This isn't automatic or perfect. Sometimes we fail to sympathize, and the intensity of our sympathetic feeling is usually weaker than the original emotion. But this imaginative resonance with others' experiences is fundamental to human nature and essential to moral judgment. How do we judge whether an action is right or wrong, a feeling appropriate or inappropriate? Through sympathy, Smith argues. We imagine ourselves in the position of the person acting and ask, would I feel the same way in that situation? If yes, we approve. The sentiment is proper, appropriate, fitting. If no, we disapprove. The sentiment is improper, excessive, or deficient. A person who becomes violently angry over a trivial slight strikes us as improper because we wouldn't feel such intense anger in that situation. Our sympathy with their emotion falls short, and this failure of sympathy constitutes disapproval. But Smith recognizes a problem. How do we judge our own conduct? We can't simply ask, would I sympathize with my own feelings, because we're already feeling them intensely. We need some way to step outside ourselves. This is where Smith introduces his most original and influential concept, the impartial spectator. The impartial spectator is an imagined observer, fair, well-informed, and impartial, who judges our conduct from an external perspective. Smith calls this figure the man within the breast, or the great judge and arbiter of our conduct. When we're deciding how to act or evaluating our own behavior, we imagine what this impartial spectator would think. Would they approve? Would they sympathize with our feelings and motives? This internalized judge, formed through our experience of others' reactions to us, becomes our conscience. Smith writes, "We suppose ourselves the spectators of our own behavior and endeavor to imagine what effect it would, in this light, produce upon us. This is the only looking glass by which we can, in some measure, with the eyes of other people, scrutinize the propriety of our own conduct. The impartial spectator is how we achieve moral self-evaluation. It's our capacity to view ourselves as others view us, to judge ourselves as fairly as we judge others." Smith makes careful distinctions in moral judgment. He distinguishes between propriety and merit. Propriety concerns whether our feelings and actions are appropriate, whether they fit the situation, and whether an impartial spectator would sympathize with them. Merit concerns whether we deserve reward or punishment, whether our conduct benefits or harms others in ways that warrant gratitude or resentment. Both judgments involve sympathy, but they focus on different aspects of conduct. Most importantly, Smith distinguishes between justice and beneficence. Justice is what he calls a negative virtue. It consists in not harming others. Smith writes, "Mere justice is, upon most occasions, but a negative virtue, and only hinders us from violating either the person or the estate or the reputation of their neighbors. The man who barely abstains from violating either the person or the estate or the reputation of their neighbors has surely very little positive merit. Justice is the minimum we owe others. We can fulfill all the rules of justice," Smith notes, "by sitting still and doing nothing, by simply not injuring anyone. Beneficence, by contrast, is a positive virtue, actively helping others, being generous, kind, charitable. Beneficence is praiseworthy, admirable, and creates gratitude. But here's the crucial difference. Justice can be enforced, beneficence cannot. Society can legitimately punish violations of justice, theft, assault, fraud, breach of contract. These harm others, and society must prevent such harms. But society cannot force beneficence.
We can't compel people to be generous or charitable. Beneficence must be voluntary to have moral worth." This distinction has profound implications for Smith's later economic and political thought. A well-ordered society requires justice, secure property rights, enforcement of contracts, protection from violence and fraud. Without justice, commerce and cooperation are impossible. But a well-ordered society doesn't require everyone to be benevolent or charitable beyond certain minimal duties. Self-interested economic activity, as long as it respects justice, is perfectly legitimate. This is how Smith reconciles the theory of moral sentiments with the wealth of nations. Markets operate within a framework of justice, and self-interest in markets is constrained by both legal rules, justice, and moral sentiments, sympathy, propriety, the judgment of the impartial spectator. Some 19th century German scholars thought they had discovered an Adam Smith problem. an apparent contradiction between the sympathetic human beings of the theory of moral sentiments and the self-interested economic actors of the wealth of nations. But this is a false problem. Smith never denied that people are self-interested. He denied that they are only self-interested. And he never said self-interest is morally admirable in all contexts. He said it's a legitimate and productive motive in commercial contexts, where it's constrained by justice and regulated by competition. The butcher, brewer, and baker of the wealth of nations pursue their self-interest, but they must do so justly, and their self-interest benefits us through the products they provide.
The theory of moral sentiments also emphasizes self-command, the virtue of controlling one's passions appropriately. This doesn't mean suppressing all emotion, which would be impossible and undesirable. It means moderating our feelings, so they're proportionate to their objects and appropriate to our situations. The person who maintains composure in adversity, who doesn't fly into excessive anger or sink into debilitating grief, who feels strongly but appropriately, this person exercises self-command. Smith expanded his discussion of self-command significantly in the 6th edition, published in 1790, just before his death, showing that he considered it increasingly important in his mature thought. Modern psychology and neuroscience have largely vindicated Smith's account of moral sentiments. Research confirms that empathy, essentially Smith's sympathy, is crucial to moral judgment. We do imaginatively simulate others' experiences, and this simulation affects how we evaluate their conduct and our own. The discovery of mirror neurons, brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing it, provides a neural basis for sympathetic identification. Studies of moral development show that conscience develops much as Smith described. Through internalizing the reactions of others, we form an internal judge that guides our conduct even when no one is watching. Behavioral economists like Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler have rediscovered many of Smith's psychological insights. Smith understood that people aren't the purely rational, self-interested maximizers of neoclassical economic models. We care about fairness. We're influenced by others' opinions. We make decisions based on emotion as well as calculation. We follow rules and norms even when it's not in our narrow self-interest. Smith's moral philosophy provides a richer, more realistic picture of human motivation than simplified economic models. Understanding the theory of moral sentiments is essential for understanding Adam Smith properly. He wasn't a crude advocate of selfishness or greed. He was a moral philosopher who believed that human beings are complex, capable of both self-interest and sympathy, motivated by both personal gain and moral sentiment, guided by both prudence and conscience. When we turn to the wealth of nations, we'll see that his economic analysis rests on this moral foundation. Markets work for Smith not because people are angels, but because properly designed institutions can channel self-interest towards socially beneficial ends, while sympathy, justice, and the judgment of the impartial spectator constrain the worst abuses. This is a sophisticated vision, far more nuanced than the caricature of Smith as a prophet of pure self-interest. 17 years after the theory of moral sentiments, on March 9, 1776, the same year as the American Declaration of Independence, and just 5 months before David Hume's death, Adam Smith published his second masterwork, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. This massive 2-volume work, nearly 1,000 pages long, would transform economics from a collection of merchant wisdom and government policy prescriptions into a systematic science. Smith had actually visited a small pin factory, and he describes what he saw in vivid detail. Making a pin seems simple. It's just a small piece of wire with a point at one end and a head at the other. But Smith observed that the process could be divided into about 18 distinct operations. One man draws out the wire, another straightens it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business, to whiten the pins is another, and even putting them into paper is a separate operation. In the factory Smith visited, 10 men working together, with some performing 2 or 3 of these operations, could make upwards of 48,000 pins in a day. That's 4,800 pins per person per day. But Smith calculates that if these same 10 men worked separately and independently, each one trying to make complete pins by himself, they certainly could not each of them have made 20, perhaps not 1 pin in a day. The productivity increase from division of labor is staggering, potentially as much as 4,800 times greater output per person. Why does dividing labor increase productivity so dramatically? Smith identifies 3 reasons. First, the division of labor increases each worker's dexterity. When you do the same simple operation repeatedly, you become extraordinarily skilled at it. Second, dividing labor saves the time usually lost in switching from one task to another. When you must constantly shift between different operations, gathering different tools and materials, you waste time in every transition. Third, dividing labor encourages the invention of machines. When workers focus on one simple operation, they naturally think about easier and readier methods of performing it, leading to mechanical innovations. Smith notes that many machines were invented by common workmen, not learned engineers, because the workers understood their specific tasks intimately. But the division of labor is limited by what Smith calls the extent of the market. This is the subject of Chapter 3, and it's a crucial insight. You can only have extensive specialization if there's a large enough market to support it. In a small, isolated village, you can't have a specialized pin maker because there aren't enough customers. Everyone would make their own pins, or one person would make pins part-time while also farming, carpentry, and doing other tasks. But in a large city with good transportation to other markets, pin making can be a full-time profession. Someone can spend their entire life making pins because there are enough customers to buy them. This immediately suggests the importance of trade. Trade expands the market. It allows greater specialization, which increases productivity, which creates more wealth. This will become central to Smith's argument against mercantilist policies that restricted trade. But first, Smith needs to explain why people trade in the first place. The division of labor, Smith argues, arises from a certain propensity in human nature, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. Whether this propensity is an original principle of human nature or a consequence of our faculties of reason and speech, Smith leaves open. But he notes it appears to be unique to humans. Animals don't trade. Nobody ever saw a dog make a fair and deliberate exchange of one bone for another with another dog, Smith observes. But humans constantly exchange, and this natural tendency, combined with self-interest, produces the division of labor and the complex market economy. Here, Smith introduces perhaps the most famous passage in all of economics, his observation about the butcher, the brewer, and the baker. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, Smith writes, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. This is often misunderstood as a celebration of selfishness or greed. It's not. Remember, Smith wrote the theory of moral sentiments first. He never denied that humans are capable of benevolence and sympathy. His point here is much more specific. In commercial transactions in the marketplace, we don't need to appeal to the benevolence of others because appealing to their self-interest works better. The butcher sells you meat not because he loves you, but because he wants your money to buy things he needs. This is perfectly legitimate, and crucially, it works reliably. You can't depend on people's benevolence for your daily dinner because benevolence is limited and uncertain. But you can depend on their self-interest because everyone has it and it's predictable.
Self-interest in markets, properly channeled, benefits everyone. When the butcher pursues profit, he must offer meat that people want to buy at prices they're willing to pay. Competition with other butchers keeps his prices reasonable and his quality acceptable. If he charges too much or sells poor meat, customers go elsewhere. His self-interest compels him to serve customers well. This is the great insight. In competitive markets, self-interest and social benefit align. You serve yourself by serving others. This leads to Smith's most famous metaphor, the invisible hand. In pursuing his own interest, Smith writes, the individual investor or merchant is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By seeking profit, by directing capital to its most productive uses, by responding to consumer demand, individuals unintentionally create a prosperous economic order. No central planner designs this order. It emerges spontaneously from countless individual decisions. Now, it's important to note that the phrase invisible hand appears only once in the entire Wealth of Nations, and the context is quite specific. Smith is discussing why merchants often prefer to invest in domestic rather than foreign industry. The concept has been vastly overextended by later economists and ideologues who use the invisible hand of the market as a general principle justifying unlimited free markets. Smith never said markets always work perfectly or that self-interest always produces optimal outcomes. He was making a more limited point. Self-interested behavior in competitive markets with proper legal and institutional frameworks often produces beneficial, unintended consequences. We'll see in the next section that Smith recognized many situations where markets fail and government intervention is necessary.
Competition plays a crucial role in Smith's system. When there are many sellers competing for customers, prices tend toward what Smith calls the natural price, the price just sufficient to cover the costs of production, including normal profits. If prices rise above the natural price, high profits attract new competitors, increasing supply and driving prices back down. If prices fall below the natural price, losses drive producers out, reducing supply and allowing prices to recover. Competition is the mechanism that prevents excessive profits and ensures that resources flow to their most valued uses. All of this, the division of labor, specialization, exchange, markets, requires capital. Capital, or stock, as Smith calls it, is the accumulated tools, materials, and goods needed for production. Before production can begin, someone must have saved enough to purchase tools, raw materials, and to maintain workers while they work. This capital accumulation, Smith argues, is essential for economic development. The more capital a society accumulates, the more extensive the division of labor can become. The more productive workers are, the wealthier the society grows. Smith distinguishes between productive and unproductive labor, a controversial distinction that's often misunderstood. Productive labor, in Smith's definition, adds to the value of the materials it works on and produces something durable that can be sold. Manufacturing is productive. Unproductive labor produces services that perish in the moment of production. This isn't a moral judgment. Smith isn't saying unproductive labor is useless or bad. He includes in this category some of the most respectable professions: government officials, military officers, clergy, lawyers, physicians, teachers, and entertainers. These provide valuable services, but they don't add to the stock of durable goods. Smith's distinction is about explaining economic growth. Societies grow wealthier primarily through productive labor that adds to capital stock, not through services alone. Perhaps Smith's most fundamental insight is his redefinition of wealth itself. For centuries, under the dominant mercantilist thinking, wealth meant gold and silver, precious metals in the treasury. Nations competed to accumulate bullion through trade surpluses, colonies, and restrictive trade policies. But Smith argued that this conception of wealth is fundamentally mistaken. The real wealth of a nation, he insisted, is not precious metals, but the annual produce of its land and labor, the goods and services its people produce and consume each year. Gold and silver are merely convenient media of exchange. They facilitate trade, but they're not themselves wealth. This redefinition transforms everything. If wealth is productive capacity, not gold, then trade is not a zero-sum game where one nation's gain is another's loss. Both parties can benefit from trade by specializing in what they produce most efficiently and exchanging. Imports are not a drain on national wealth, but a source of goods that increase consumption and welfare. The goal of economic policy should not be to hoard gold, but to increase productive capacity, to enable the division of labor, accumulate capital, remove obstacles to commerce, and allow markets to coordinate economic activity efficiently. Smith's vision of how economies work, with specialized individuals pursuing self-interest in competitive markets, coordinated by prices, generating prosperity without central direction, was revolutionary. It challenged the entire mercantilist system that had dominated European economic policy for 2 centuries. It provided a theoretical foundation for free trade, limited government intervention in commerce, and trust in market mechanisms. But Smith's vision was more nuanced than many of his later followers acknowledged. He recognized that markets require proper institutional frameworks, that self-interest must be constrained by justice and sympathy, and that government has important roles to play. We'll explore these crucial qualifications in the next section. The longest sustained argument in The Wealth of Nations comes in Book 4, where Smith demolishes the mercantile system, what we now call mercantilism, that dominated European economic policy for 2 centuries. Mercantilism was based on a fundamental confusion, the belief that wealth consists in money, particularly gold and silver. Mercantilist policy aimed to accumulate precious metals through trade surpluses, exporting more than importing. To achieve this, governments subsidized exports, restricted imports with tariffs and prohibitions, established colonies for exclusive trade, granted monopolies to chartered companies, and regulated commerce extensively. Smith argues that this entire system rests on a mistake. Wealth is not money. Money is merely a medium of exchange, useful for facilitating trade, but not itself the goal of economic activity. As Smith puts it, it would be too ridiculous to go about seriously to prove that wealth does not consist in money or in gold and silver, but in what money purchases and is valuable only for purchasing. The real wealth of a nation is the annual produce of its land and labor, the goods and services its people actually consume. If Scotland grows wealthy, it's not because Scots hoard gold coins in vaults, but because Scottish workers produce more clothing, food, tools, and other useful goods. Trade, Smith argues, is not a zero-sum game, where one nation's gain is another's loss. Both parties benefit from exchange. Each country exports goods it produces efficiently and imports goods other countries produce more efficiently. If a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we ourselves can make it, better buy it of them with some part of the produce of our own industry, employed in a way in which we have some advantage. Smith offers a memorable example. Scotland could grow grapes in hothouses and make wine, but at about 30 times the expense of buying equally good wine from France. This would be absurd. Scotland should produce what it produces well, perhaps wool or linen, and trade for wine. The mercantile system, Smith argues, serves not national interest, but the narrow interests of merchants and manufacturers. Restrictions on imports protect domestic producers from competition, allowing them to charge higher prices and earn excessive profits. But this harms consumers who pay more, and it misallocates resources, directing capital and labor to less productive uses. Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, Smith insists. The interest of producers should be attended to only as necessary for promoting the interest of consumers. But mercantilism reverses this, sacrificing consumer welfare to producer profits. Who designed this system? Not consumers, certainly, but producers, and particularly merchants and manufacturers. Smith is remarkably blunt about this. The mercantile system, he writes, was contrived not by statesmen concerned for national welfare, but by merchants concerned for their own profits. It cannot be very difficult to determine who have been the contrivers of this whole mercantile system, not the consumers, we may believe, whose interest has been entirely neglected, but producers. And among this latter class, our merchants and manufacturers have been by far the principal architects. Smith's distrust of merchants and manufacturers runs throughout The Wealth of Nations. He offers one of the most famous warnings in economics. People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. Merchants naturally seek monopolies, special privileges, and government protection from competition. Their interest is to widen the market but narrow the competition, and narrowing competition is always against the public interest. Smith insists that proposals for new laws or regulations coming from merchants and manufacturers should be examined with the most suspicious attention, because these men have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who accordingly have upon many occasions both deceived and oppressed it. This is crucial for understanding Smith properly. He's not a spokesman for business interests or corporate power.
This means establishing an exact administration of justice, a court system to resolve disputes, enforce contracts, protect property rights, and punish crimes. Smith is remarkably honest about what this means. Civil government, so far as it is instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor, or of those who have some property against those who have none at all. This isn't a celebration of inequality, but a recognition that legal systems protect existing property relations. Still, justice is essential. Without secure property rights and contract enforcement, commerce cannot function. Third, public works and institutions. Here, Smith recognizes what we now call market failures, situations where private provision is inadequate because the profit could never repay the expense to any individual or small number of individuals, though it may frequently do much more than repay it to a great society. What does this include? Infrastructure, particularly good roads, canals, navigable rivers, and harbors. These are upon that account the greatest of all improvements, Smith writes, because they connect distant markets and reduce transportation costs. But individuals won't build them because they can't capture enough of the benefit to justify the expense, so government must. Education is another area where Smith sees a need for public provision. And here he makes a crucial point about the division of labor's dark side. While specialization increases productivity, it can be mentally degrading for workers. The man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations, Smith writes, has no occasion to exert his understanding. He naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion, and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become.
This is a powerful indictment of industrialized labor's effects on human development. Smith's solution: public education. The government should facilitate education for common people, ensuring they're not reduced to mere cogs in industrial machinery. Smith even supports some regulations and restrictions when necessary for public safety or welfare. He defends regulations on banking, for instance, noting that such regulations may, no doubt, be considered as in some respects a violation of natural liberty. But those exertions of the natural liberty of a few individuals, which might endanger the security of the whole society, are and ought to be restrained by the laws of all governments. He supports usury laws limiting interest rates. He even defends certain provisions of the Navigation Acts, which required goods imported to Britain to be carried on British ships, because this promoted maritime skills useful for naval defense. On taxation, Smith lays out 4 maxims that remain influential. Taxes should be equal, meaning proportional to ability to pay, certain, not arbitrary, convenient for the taxpayer, and economical, minimizing administrative costs. Smith goes further, suggesting that the rich should contribute not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than in that proportion. He supports higher taxes on luxury goods like fancy carriages, noting that this makes the indolence and vanity of the rich contribute in a very easy manner to the relief of the poor. Throughout The Wealth of Nations, Smith shows concern for workers' welfare that's often ignored by those who invoke him to oppose labor protections or minimum wages. He writes that no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. It is but equity, besides, that they who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole body of the people should have such a share of the produce of their own labor as to be themselves tolerably well fed, clothed, and lodged. He notes that laws prohibiting workers from combining to raise wages, but not prohibiting masters from combining to lower them, are fundamentally unjust. He observes that masters are always and everywhere in a sort of tacit but constant and uniform combination not to raise the wages of labor above their actual rate. So what is Smith's vision? It's not pure laissez-faire or unlimited free markets. It's a system of competitive markets operating within a framework of justice, law, and appropriate public institutions. Government provides defense, administers justice, builds infrastructure, facilitates education, and regulates where necessary to prevent harm. Markets coordinate most economic activity because they're efficient at responding to consumer preferences and allocating resources. But markets require proper institutions to function well, and there are important areas where markets alone are inadequate. Self-interest drives much economic behavior, but it's constrained by justice. You can't steal or defraud, and moderated by sympathy. We care about others' welfare, not just our own. Smith's vision is remarkably balanced. He's neither a dogmatic advocate of unlimited free markets nor a believer in extensive government control of the economy. He recognizes the power of markets to create prosperity while also recognizing their limits. He trusts competition to constrain abuses while understanding that competition can be undermined by monopolies and special privileges. He values individual liberty while accepting that liberty must be constrained by justice and sometimes by regulations necessary for public welfare. This nuanced position has been distorted by later interpreters, particularly those who invoke Smith to justify positions he never held. Smith didn't celebrate greed or selfishness. Remember the theory of moral sentiments and its emphasis on sympathy and propriety. He didn't trust businesses to regulate themselves. He explicitly warned against their tendency to conspire against the public. He didn't oppose all government intervention. He outlined substantial roles for government. He didn't ignore inequality or workers' welfare. He wrote movingly about equity and the conditions of common people. Understanding Smith's actual positions rather than caricatures of them is essential for engaging with contemporary economic debates. When people invoke Smith to oppose minimum wages, environmental regulations, or progressive taxation, they're often citing a Smith who never existed, one stripped of his moral philosophy, his concerns about inequality, his recognition of market failures, and his support for government functions that serve the public good. The real Adam Smith was far more complex, far more humane, and far more relevant to our challenges than the cartoon version sometimes deployed in political arguments.
At the heart of Smith's economic analysis is a puzzle that remains contentious to this day. What determines the value of things? Why do we pay certain prices for goods? What determines wages, profits, and rents? These questions about value and distribution, who gets what from the economic pie, occupied much of The Wealth of Nations and would spark debates lasting centuries. Smith begins with a famous distinction that every economic student learns: the difference between value in use and value in exchange.
The word value, Smith writes, has two different meanings and sometimes expresses the utility of some particular object, and sometimes the power of purchasing other goods which the possession of that object conveys. The one may be called value in use, the other value in exchange. To illustrate this distinction, Smith offers one of economics' most memorable paradoxes. Nothing is more useful than water, but it will purchase scarce anything. Scarce anything can be had in exchange for it. A diamond, on the contrary, has scarce any value in use, but a very great quantity of other goods may frequently be had in exchange for it. Water is essential for life. Without it, we die. Diamonds are pretty, but not necessary. Yet diamonds command high prices while water is cheap. How can this be? Smith identifies the paradox, but doesn't fully solve it. He moves on to analyze exchange value, what determines prices in markets. His answer, at least for what he calls that early and rude state of society before the accumulation of capital and the appropriation of land, is labor. If among a nation of hunters, for example, it usually costs twice the labor to kill a beaver which it does to kill a deer, one beaver should naturally exchange for or be worth 2 deer. The amount of labor required to produce something determines its value. This is the famous labor theory of value, and Smith is often credited as one of its originators, though he was building on earlier thinkers, and his version was ambiguous. In a simple society of hunters with no capital and no private land, labor time seems like a natural measure of value. But Smith recognizes that in advanced commercial societies, the picture is more complex. Once capital has accumulated and land has been appropriated, the value of commodities must cover not just wages, but also profits for capital and rent for land. The value which the workmen add to the materials, Smith writes, resolves itself into 2 parts, of which the one pays their wages, the other the profits of their employer. So in advanced societies, Smith shifts to what's sometimes called an adding up theory. The natural price of a commodity is the sum of wages, profits, and rent paid in producing it. This creates theoretical problems. Is labor the source of value, or is value just the sum of payments to the factors of production? Smith isn't entirely clear, and his ambiguity on this point would trouble later economists. Smith also distinguishes between real and nominal price. The real price of something is the toil and trouble of acquiring it, measured in labor. The nominal price is its price in money. Money's value can fluctuate with inflation or deflation, but labor, Smith suggests, always represents the same toil and sacrifice to the laborer. Therefore, labor alone, never varying in its own value, is alone the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at all times and places be estimated and compared. This is another version of the labor theory, but it's about labor commanded, what amount of labor a commodity can purchase, rather than labor embodied, how much labor went into producing it. The distribution of income among wages, profits, and rent receives extensive treatment in The Wealth of Nations, and Smith's analysis reveals his class sympathies clearly. Book 1 contains separate chapters on wages, profits, and rent, and a concluding section that brings them together to analyze whose interests align with the public good.
On wages, Smith is remarkably sympathetic to workers. He recognizes that wage bargaining is fundamentally unequal. The workmen desire to get as much, the masters to give as little as possible, Smith writes. But masters have enormous advantages. They're fewer in number and can coordinate more easily. They can hold out much longer in disputes. Though they did not employ a single workman, masters could generally live a year or 2 upon the stocks which they have already acquired. Many workmen could not subsist a week, few could subsist a month, and scarce any a year without employment. This power asymmetry means workers are systematically disadvantaged in wage negotiations. Moreover, Smith notes, masters are always and everywhere in a sort of tacit but constant and uniform combination not to raise the wages of labor above their actual rate. When workers try to combine to raise wages, they're prosecuted. When masters combine to lower wages, nothing happens. The law, Smith observes acidly, sides with masters. Despite this structural disadvantage, Smith argues that workers deserve decent living standards. No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. It is but equity, besides, that they who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole body of the people should have such a share of the produce of their own labor as to be themselves tolerably well fed, clothed, and lodged. Smith argues that wages are highest not in the richest societies, but in growing ones. It is not the actual greatness of national wealth, but its continual increase, which occasions a rise in the wages of labor. When an economy is expanding, demand for labor grows, pushing wages up. Stagnant or declining economies see falling wages. This means the progressive state, while the society is advancing to the further acquisition rather than when it has acquired its full complement of riches, is when the condition of the laboring poor seems to be the happiest and the most comfortable.
Economic growth benefits workers. Stagnation harms them. Profits, Smith argues, are distinct from wages. They're not payment for the labor of supervision. That's a wage. Profits are the return to capital, compensation for the risk of investing stock in production. Something must be given for the profits of the undertaker of the work who hazards his stock in this adventure. As capital accumulates and competition increases, profits tend to fall. When the stocks of many rich merchants are turned into the same trade, their mutual competition naturally tends to lower its profit. This is good for consumers, lower prices, but concerning for capitalists. Rent, payment for the use of land, receives a harsher analysis. Smith views rent as fundamentally a monopoly price. The rent of land is naturally a monopoly price. It is not at all proportioned to what the landlord may have laid out upon the improvement of the land, or to what he can afford to take, but to what the farmer can afford to give. Landlords charge whatever the market will bear. They often contribute nothing to improvements, but capture the value of any increases in land productivity. Smith is notably less sympathetic to landlords than to either workers or productive capitalists. In the conclusion to Book 1, Smith brings these threads together with a class analysis that would profoundly influence later economists, including Karl Marx. Society, Smith argues, divides into three great orders based on their source of income: those who live by rent, landlords; those who live by wages, workers; and those who live by profit, capitalists and merchants. These classes have different interests, and not all of them align with the public good.
Landlords' interests, Smith suggests, are generally aligned with society's. When the economy prospers and land values rise, landlords benefit. When it stagnates, they suffer. Workers' interests are even more closely aligned with the public interest. The liberal reward of labor, therefore, as it is the effect of increasing wealth, so it is the cause of increasing population. To complain of it is to lament over the necessary effect and cause of the greatest public prosperity. But capitalists and merchants are different. As we saw in the previous section, Smith argues that their interest is never exactly the same with that of the public, and is often even opposite to it. They seek to widen markets but narrow competition, and narrowing competition harms consumers. Their proposals for legislation should be examined with the most suspicious attention because they have generally an interest to deceive and even oppress the public, and who accordingly have upon many occasions both deceived and oppressed it. This class analysis is crucial for understanding Smith's politics. He's not a simple advocate for any particular class. He's most sympathetic to workers, recognizing their disadvantages and arguing for equity. He views productive investment favorably, but distrusts merchants and manufacturers. He sees landlords as largely passive, contributing little but capturing rent. This nuanced class analysis would be developed further by David Ricardo and transformed into a revolutionary critique by Karl Marx. Smith's labor theory of value, despite its ambiguities and problems, became central to classical political economy.
David Ricardo, writing in 1817 in his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, attempted to develop Smith's insights more rigorously. Ricardo's version of the labor theory was more systematic and consistent, though still problematic. John Stuart Mill, in his enormously influential Principles of Political Economy, 1848, synthesized classical economics, including Smith's and Ricardo's value theory, while adding his own modifications and social concerns.
Most dramatically, Karl Marx built his entire critique of capitalism on a version of the labor theory of value, derived from Smith and Ricardo. Marx's theory of surplus value, the idea that capitalists exploit workers by paying them less than the value their labor creates, is an extension of Smith's observation that in advanced societies, the value workers add gets divided into wages and profits. If labor is the source of value, Marx argued, then profit represents unpaid labor, exploitation. Whether or not you accept Marx's conclusions, his analysis is unthinkable without Smith's and Ricardo's groundwork. But the labor theory of value faced serious theoretical problems, and in the 1870s, a revolution in economic thinking swept it aside. Three economists working independently, William Stanley Jevons in England, Karl Menger in Austria, and Leon Walras in Switzerland, developed what became known as marginal utility theory. Value, they argued, doesn't come from labor embodied in production, but from the subjective utility goods provide to consumers, and specifically the marginal utility, the additional satisfaction from consuming one more unit. This approach finally solved Smith's water-diamond paradox. Water has enormous total utility, but low marginal utility because we have so much of it. The last glass of water adds little to our satisfaction because we're already satisfied. Diamonds have less total utility, but enormous marginal utility because they're so scarce. The last diamond we might acquire would add substantially to our satisfaction. Price reflects marginal utility, not total utility or labor cost. This neoclassical revolution displaced the labor theory of value from mainstream economics, where it has remained marginalized ever since.
Yet Smith's influence hardly disappeared. His insights about division of labor, specialization, competition, and market coordination remain foundational. His emphasis on productivity growth as the source of increasing wealth is central to modern growth theory. His analysis of how markets coordinate activity through prices is core microeconomics. His arguments for free trade, though he argued for absolute advantage while David Ricardo later developed the stronger theory of comparative advantage, shaped trade policy for centuries. What has often been lost is Smith's nuance, his moral philosophy, and his class analysis. Smith has been transformed into a cartoon, the prophet of greed and selfishness, the enemy of all government intervention, the friend of unfettered capitalism. This cartoon appears in political rhetoric constantly. When someone opposes regulation, they invoke Adam Smith. When corporations lobby for tax cuts and subsidies, they claim Smith's authority. When economists defend inequality, they cite Smith's invisible hand. But this isn't the real Adam Smith. The real Smith wrote the theory of moral sentiments about sympathy and propriety before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. The real Smith warned that merchants and manufacturers conspire against the public and should never be trusted as policy advisors. The real Smith argued that workers deserve equity, that economic growth should benefit the many, not just the few, that the division of labor can be dehumanizing, that public education is necessary, that government has essential roles in defense, justice, and public works. The real Smith was far more complex, far more humane, and far more relevant to contemporary debates than the oversimplified version often deployed in his name.
Adam Smith's vision was never simply about economics in isolation. Throughout this episode, we've seen how his economic analysis rests on moral foundations. The theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations aren't separate works, but parts of a unified system for understanding human society. Sympathy,
The impartial spectator and moral sentiments constrain and guide self-interested behavior. Justice provides the framework within which markets operate. Self-interest is legitimate in commercial contexts, but it's not the whole of human nature, and it must respect both moral norms and legal rules. This integrated vision, markets embedded in moral and institutional frameworks, is what makes Smith's thought sophisticated and relevant, rather than a crude celebration of greed or pure self-interest. Smith's influence on policy was gradual but profound. In the decades after the Wealth of Nations, British policy slowly moved toward freer trade, though the process was contested and incomplete. The Corn Laws, which restricted grain imports to protect landowners, weren't repealed until 1846, 70 years after Smith's book and 56 years after his death. The Anti-Corn Law League invoked Smithian arguments about how protection harms consumers to benefit producers, but political resistance from landed interests was fierce. The repeal was a victory for Smithian principles, but it took generations of political struggle. Throughout the 19th century, classical political economy, built on Smith's foundations and developed by Ricardo, Malthus, Mill, and others, became the dominant framework for understanding economic questions. Free trade became the policy of Britain, and to varying degrees, other European nations. The Navigation Acts were repealed in 1849. Tariffs were reduced. Internal restrictions on trade and production were lifted. This was the age of what economic historians call the first globalization, a period of increasing international commerce, capital flows, and migration. But Smith's influence was never uncontested. In America, Alexander Hamilton had read The Wealth of Nations, but argued in his Report on Manufactures, 1791, that infant industries needed temporary protection to develop, a direct challenge to Smith's free trade arguments.
In Germany, Friedrich List developed a nationalist economics that emphasized the importance of building domestic industries behind tariff walls before opening to international competition. The Marxist tradition engaged deeply with Smith's labor theory of value and class analysis, but transformed them into a revolutionary critique of capitalism. Smith's ideas shaped the debates, but they didn't settle them. In the 20th century, Smith was claimed by various sides of ideological disputes. The Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, and others invoked Smith as the prophet of free markets and limited government. Friedrich Hayek extended Smith's concept of the invisible hand into a broader theory of spontaneous order, arguing that centralized economic planning was inherently inferior to decentralized market coordination. Public choice theorists used Smith's skepticism about government to build theories of government failure paralleling market failure. But often these invocations simplified Smith, ignored the theory of moral sentiments, downplayed the roles Smith assigned to government, and overlooked his deep distrust of merchants and manufacturers. What would Adam Smith say about our contemporary economic challenges? Obviously, we can't know for certain. We can't resurrect 18th century thinkers and ask them. But we can ask what principles from Smith's work might apply to current debates, recognizing both what's useful and what's limited in trying to apply 18th century thought to 21st century problems. On globalization and free trade, Smith's arguments remain influential. Modern global supply chains represent an extreme extension of his division of labor principle. Components for smartphones or automobiles come from dozens of countries, each specializing in particular tasks. The efficiency gains are enormous, just as Smith predicted, but Smith would also recognize the costs. When factories close and entire communities lose their economic base, Smith's concern for workers' welfare and his support for public education and infrastructure suggest he would favor policies to help displaced workers retrain and relocate, not just celebrate efficiency gains while ignoring human costs. On inequality, Smith's position seems clear.
No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable, he wrote. The equity principle that those who produce should benefit runs throughout the Wealth of Nations. Smith supported progressive taxation,
arguing it's not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense, not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than in that proportion. He recognized that bargaining power between workers and employers is fundamentally unequal. Contemporary levels of inequality, with stagnant wages for many workers while returns to capital soar, would likely concern Smith deeply. He'd probably support policies to strengthen workers' bargaining power, improve education and skills, and ensure that economic growth benefits broadly, not just those at the top. On corporate power and monopoly, Smith's position is even clearer. His warning that people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, seems remarkably prescient in an age of industry consolidation, lobbying, and regulatory capture. His insistence that proposals from merchants and manufacturers should be examined with the most suspicious attention because they have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, reads like a warning about corporate influence on policy today. Smith would almost certainly support vigorous antitrust enforcement to break up monopolies and prevent market concentration. He'd be skeptical of corporate lobbying and the influence of money in politics. The idea that corporations should have unlimited ability to spend money on political campaigns, as permitted after Citizens United, would horrify Smith, who already thought merchants had too much political influence in the 18th century. On financial regulation, Smith explicitly supported restraints on banking when necessary for public safety. Such regulations may, no doubt, be considered as in some respects a violation of natural liberty, he wrote, but those exertions of the natural liberty of a few individuals which might endanger the security of the whole society are and ought to be restrained by the laws of all governments.
This requires constant vigilance against both market failures, monopolies, externalities, public goods problems, and government failures, corruption, capture by special interests, inefficiency. What distinguishes Smith from both pure free market libertarians and advocates of extensive government control is his refusal to be dogmatic. He was pro-market because markets work well in many contexts, not because they're perfect or sacred. He supported government roles where necessary, not because government is always wise, but because some functions can't be performed privately. He combined moral philosophy with economic analysis because he understood that markets are human institutions shaped by and shaping human behavior, values, and relationships. The most common error in invoking Smith today is to ignore this nuance. When people cite Smith to oppose minimum wages, environmental regulations, or progressive taxation, they're often citing a Smith who never existed, one stripped of his moral philosophy, his concerns about inequality, his sympathy for workers, his distrust of corporate power, and his recognition that government has essential roles. When others dismiss Smith as a prophet of pure selfishness or crude capitalism, they're attacking a caricature, not the actual thinker who began the theory of moral sentiments by insisting that humans are inherently interested in the fortune of others, and who filled the wealth of nations with concerns about justice, equity, and the welfare of common people. The real Adam Smith offers something more valuable than simple slogans for either side of our contemporary debates. He offers a framework for thinking about how self-interest and social welfare can be aligned through proper institutions, how markets can serve human flourishing when properly structured, how sympathy and justice constrain and guide economic behavior, and how we can build societies that are both prosperous and humane. His vision isn't perfect. He got some things wrong, left some questions unanswered, and couldn't anticipate everything about our vastly different modern economy. But his insistence on treating economics as inseparable from ethics, his attention to actual human welfare rather than abstract efficiency, and his balanced recognition of both market power and market limits remain as relevant today as they were in 1776. Adam Smith created the framework we still use for understanding market economies, but he did so with remarkable humanity, moral seriousness, and intellectual honesty. He acknowledged complexity
admitted uncertainty, and never claimed to have all the answers. In an age of ideological certainty and oversimplified economic slogans, perhaps his most important lesson is his combination of systematic analysis with moral humility. The recognition that understanding human society requires both rigorous thinking and moral wisdom, both confidence in our insights and awareness of our limits. We've journeyed through Adam Smith's revolutionary insights, from the pin factory to the invisible hand, from sympathy and the impartial spectator to the division of labor and free trade. But perhaps Smith's most enduring lesson isn't any single economic principle or moral theory. It's his refusal to be dogmatic, his insistence on looking at actual human beings rather than abstract models, and his recognition that creating a good society requires both systematic thinking and moral wisdom. In 1776, the same year America declared independence and David Hume died, Smith published a book that would change how we understand prosperity, markets, and human cooperation. Nearly 2.5 centuries later, we're still grappling with the questions he raised, still debating how to balance efficiency and equity, still trying to build institutions that align self-interest with social welfare, still learning that economics divorced from ethics produces neither good economics nor good ethics. Adam Smith didn't give us all the answers, but he gave us better questions, a framework for thinking about them, and a reminder that the wealth of nations ultimately rests on the character of their people and the quality of their institutions. In an age of economic anxiety, rising inequality, and debates about capitalism's future, that might be exactly what we need to hear. This has been Timeless Thinkers. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and remember, the examined life is worth living, and the examined economy is worth building.